Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society's series of In Conversations with RPS Awardees. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Joe McDonald, the Society's Awards Manager, who will introduce our two speakers this evening, Sunil Gupta and Clare Grafik. Joe, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Joe McDonald and I'm the awards manager at the Royal Photographic Society, the world's oldest photography organisation with a history back to 1853. The Society Awards cover the breadth of photography and imaging from science and art through to curation, education and specific genre of photography. This evening's talk, which is being recorded, is the third of our talks and in conversations with our award recipients, and you can find all information on further talks on our website. I'm delighted to welcome Sunil Gupta HonFRPS and Clare Grafik tonight. Sunil was born in India and relocated to Montreal, Canada, before studying at the Royal College of Art in London. He's been using photography as a critical practice since the 1970s. His work has been instrumental in raising awareness around the political realities concerning the fight for international gay rights and of making visible the tensions between tradition and modernity, public and private, body and body politics. His first major retrospective exhibition, offering a complex and layered view of his unique transcontinental photographic vision, opened at the Photographers Gallery, London, last year to great acclaim. Clare Grafik is head of exhibitions at the Photographers Gallery. She's previously worked in other public institutions, including the ICA and Whitechapel, and ran a course on photographic archives with Birkbeck College. Curatorial projects have included exhibitions with Taryn Simon, Antoine Dagata, Sineb Sadira, Bettina von Schweel, and more recently a group show entitled Double Take, Drawing and Photography, and the solo exhibition Jan Savaboda Against the Light in collaboration with Pavel Van Schat. After Sunil and Clare's conversation, we will open up the public Q&A. If you have questions, please enter them in Zoom chat and we will pick up with these during the Q&A. So over to you, Sunil and Clare.
Thanks, Joe. I'd just like to say thank you so much, Joe and Michael, for offering this opportunity to speak with and hear Sunil discuss his work. The Photographers Gallery has been extremely grateful to have been able to collaborate with Sunil and Mark Seeley, Director of Autograph, on his retrospective show entitled From Here to Eternity, which is currently hanging rather lonely in the galleries at Ramillies Street. We're very grateful to hear this week that May could offer a short opportunity to see the exhibition before it prepares to tour to the Ryerson Image Centre in Toronto later this year. We shall see. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you've all been able to keep well and weather this last very challenging 11 months. I first came across Sunil's work during my photography MA, and as a student, I was an avid fan of the work of the much under-recognised, I felt, Dwayne Michaels and his use of text and image to create narrative. And to me, at least, Sunil's work also employed this in a particularly subversive, political and personal way. Sunil's artistic strategies, often traversing between cultures and identities, provide a fascinating dialogue between the documentary, the performative and the staged. An indication of his influence is just how many institutions have showcased his work through the last 40 plus years in the UK, from Camera Work, ICA, Impressions, Focal Point, Standpoint Gallery, the Showroom and the Arnolfini to the Tate. He is a central participant in the landmark exhibition Masculinities, shown last year and sadly cut off by the pandemic at the Barbican Centre, but now happily, I hope, on a European tour. When I first joined the Photographers Gallery, I was as much aware of Sunil's contribution to the programme as an artist, including the 1987 show The Body Politic, along with artists including John Copland, Joe Spence, Barbara Kruger and Hiro Sato, as his curatorial work through shows including An Economy of Signs, Contemporary Indian Photography in 1990. While photography sits at the centre of Sunil's practice, it is not just his work as an artist and curator in which his influence has been felt. He is a teacher, a mentor and an archivist. He was a formative figure at the inception of Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers, in 1988. And he has been involved with race politics and campaigned for gay rights in the UK and India throughout his life. He has given a voice to queer communities, highlighting ideas of family, support, collaboration, and intimacy through his own experiences. Sunil has been an agent for change, inclusion, challenge, and creativity for many decades now on the photography scene. And in many ways, his career has mirrored many of the wider cultural shifts, both seismic and subtle, that have occurred within it. Perhaps this is a good place to hand to Sunil to talk us through some of the material he's collated for us in his presentation. And we look forward to a discussion with you all at the end. Over to you, Sunil.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for that very thorough introduction. I feel exhausted just listening to that. So, well, first of all, I must thank the RPS for inviting me to speak, and of course for awarding me this honorary fellowship. It means a lot. The last time I spoke to a collection of RPS fellows was back in the 80s in Calcutta, and they wanted their money back. So I'm sure that's not going to be the case tonight. We're short of time, and it's a massive spread, and so we'll try and make it brief and entertaining, shall we? Claire and I, you've met on and off over the years, so it's like you're both familiar, but also we're not like too familiar in this sense either. So that's probably quite a good thing. So we don't have any in-jokes between us. So, yeah, shall we just go straight to the pictures, because they kind of tell their story. I'm just going to start screen sharing then maybe. So okay, so I thought we'd start this evening here. This is Contemporary Color Photography, a show that was selected, as it says, by Sue Davies, who was then the director and the founder of the Photographers Gallery in 1980. Took place in Salford, part of Salford 80. So there's some names some of us might know now today. There's Paul Graham and Mary Marr and so on. I, however, was still in my second year at Farnham, and I was making this work that I brought with me from Canada, kind of my version of life as a young gay man in Canada, very much modeled on Duane Michaels. I'm glad you mentioned him. With small Cibachrome prints with some writing underneath. So literally the formal imitation of him. Now this gay work didn't do very well in Farnham, because in those days there was a fair amount of antipathy, and the age of consent was 21, and you weren't really allowed to discuss gay issues in art school, which I found strange. I was a little bit older, like maybe 24, but I'd come from New York to this place, and everything was very hush-hush. So that was a very strange feeling back then. Anyway, I persisted. So I used to come to London to find my subjects. London Gay Switchboard was an audio visual that I made. Actually, once again in Farnham, which I don't think anybody ever saw. And then on the right-hand side is what I thought I wanted to do really in my years of training, which is to be a documentary photographer with a conscience, do social justice. So I'd gone off to India for over a couple of years to shoot a particular village and to try and investigate rural poverty and that kind of thing. But while I was in India, then I kind of was curious about what was happening in India to gay men. And not very much, I discovered. And not only that, but they didn't want to be in a picture. So I tried to make some pictures anyway. Of course, couldn't show anyone. And I did this particular image in my portfolio. And then when I was hustling for work, and the Guardian editor said, "Is there a story?" And I said, "Yes, I'll go home and write one." And so that's the first time something public came out of India and something gay, the kind of preamble to the Exiles work.
Was this,
But,
can I just ask you, Sunil, here, could I just ask you
yeah.
something about that previous slide? Because sorry, what year is this 82?
82.
So I'm just, because obviously a lot of people will know, because the Christopher Street work has been quite publicized in the last year. And I am always struck by the massive contrast between the Christopher Street work and then these works from India in the early 80s. And I'm wondering, just on a personal level, when you showed that the sort of the Cibachrome, the text, was that was produced pre-Christopher Street in Montreal, was it?
Yes, it was. That was produced before, yeah.
And was that, at that time, if we just back up a bit, were you, you weren't studying photography in Montreal?
No, I was in business school. You know, when you were Asian, you only had 3 choices. Little Indian boys, you could either be a doctor, an engineer, or businessman.
Yeah. So how was it that photography came to you first? Because how did you come across photography initially?
It was a hobby, you know, through my school years. And then in college, I joined the gay liberation group and became their photographer as a hobbyist. But it gave me a public reason and a public literally, because we had a paper and pictures appeared and you got a little credit. And then I kind of, and then I had something to shoot and public to see it. But I didn't think it was going to be a profession until I came to New York. I was, also to go to business school. It's in New York that the big shift happened out of business school and into photography. I think it's because I'd never been in a city which had that level of an interest in photography. I'd come from a smaller town that had no photographic galleries, no photo history to be seen. Photography was a trade, you know, it wasn't something that you saw in a gallery anyway. And then suddenly in New York, there were 50 photo galleries and the history of photography was on the walls and historical people were still alive and teaching. And I went to study with one of them, you know, a couple of them, Lisette Model and Philippe Holzman, both exiles from France, you know, from the late 30s. And so, and they, I was completely blown away by it all. And they were lovely. And Lisette particularly seemed to take a shine to me and said, darling, I think you should do photography. And I said, I don't think it's going to make me any money somehow. And she said, not to worry about it. And so I said, okay. And I gave up my MBA and it's been photography ever since, much to the horror of my parents who were not amused, I have to say. And I had to go back to them and give up New York there and then. That didn't go down very well at all.
Did you have to sort of come out as a photographer to them?
Yeah, you know, it was a bit much. First I came out as gay, then I was going to do photography. And they said, you know, you're going to live your life in jeans, carrying a bag around your shoulder, you know, like a tradesperson. You know, they had this vision of me in a suit sitting in an office in the city somewhere, you know, telling people what to do. So I'm with a wife and some kids somewhere in a suburb. That was a part of it too.
And was when you were studying, did you feel, because some people might have just got carried on their own with those kinds of beginnings in Montreal, not everyone thinks to go and study, you know, study photography formally. What was your sort of drive, what was driving you to actually go make it more of an official training?
I think partly my middle class Indian background, you know, where you have to train to do something for it to be proper. And then secondly, photography courses were kind of coming out of trade school and becoming college courses right when I arrived. So, and I followed somebody to New York and then to London, and then suddenly I was in London. And there were some courses were emerging. And then I had this very pressing need to get a visa because the Home Office was going to throw me out after 6 months. Because luckily, I arrived with a Canadian passport, which meant that, you know, I wasn't Indian, so that was fine. You can come visit for 6 months. But then they said you should go home. And then I said, no, I'm going to school. So, and I remember having interviews at LCP in the old Elephant and Castle building. And I thought it was, you know, the backside of the world. I thought, I don't want to come to Elephant and Castle for 3 years, thank you. And I think it was still very much a trade school, because they asked me in an interview what kind of photography I wanted to do, like fashion or editorial or advertising something. And I hadn't even thought about that. So I said, no, that's not really what I was thinking. Anyway, then I went to one in Farnham, and then Farnham struck me as the kind of England I had fantasized about living in New York. And you would think of England as, as Hampshire and sorry, like grain fields and picket fence, and horses and all that. So yeah. So I went to Farnham for better or worse.
And
so,
who was teaching? Who was at Farnham at the time? Was that a reason you went? Was it more the context of where Farnham was? It looked like a more attractive place, or was there someone teaching there that you particularly was interested in? Or
no, it was more my idea of England, and also it was an art school which I quite liked. It was it was a place where people made things, and everybody who taught there at the time had come from the world of work. So there was nobody like famous photographer or anything. But the good thing was that
it must have seemed a big change from the New York scene. I mean, it must have, the difference.
It was a very big, a quite shocking change, because first of all, there was this sort of weird kind of anti-gay attitude, which I hadn't thought was going to happen. And then I'd come from relatively, I guess, very cosmopolitan Manhattan photo scene where I'd been going to auctions, I'd made friends with people who were buyers for clients, who were buying, I don't know, Diane Arbus prints. I met the printer who printed the Diane Arbus prints. I was sort of in this, very close to this photographic culture. I had classes with Philippe Holtzman in his apartment in Central Park West, that kind of thing. Suddenly I'm in Farnham, where everybody's come from school and nobody's been to New York, let alone London, and nobody has seen the history of photography. That was one of the key things that a lot of people I studied with, and even the people who taught me, knew the history of photography only through books.
Yes.
People hadn't seen an actual Edward Western print. And I think people didn't realize that a lot of the history of photography is very small. It's contact prints. And so I think there was a disconnect between, and I was very print oriented, I think because of New York. It was very modernist, that moment in the 70s. And so, and I remember in the darkroom, very few people wanted to use what we used to call the wet darkroom, but we had this dry one which had a machine in it, even for black and white. And everybody used that one and made resin coated prints. It was dry and it was easy. They came out in 2 minutes and it wasn't messy. And they didn't seem to understand that there were a lot of nuances in the chemistry of it. So that's what appealed to me, was that chemistry side, because I did this other course in New York with another guy called George Tyson. It was one of those courses where you came with 10 negatives. And then every week you made a different kind of print from the same negatives. And after a semester, you had 100 pictures from 10 negatives, all different, So you realize how subjective it is and how tonally it can matter. And if you mix your own developers, and if you have two developers, A and B, going and change the color, change all kinds of things, it was, I found all that fascinating. And that's what I liked about it, was the printing. A lot of people in my time, in my college years, were fixated on shooting. They were on cameras and f-stops and lenses, but I was more interested in what happened in the darkroom.
And how also the sense, because in New York, one feels the streets were such a rich ground for photographing, and obviously, well, Farnham has its own personality, but it's not. So how did you, going from that sense of street, the street being your kind of canvas, how did it affect your work coming over here and studying?
Well, I tried to substitute Farnham with Guildford, And I had some weird, curious experiences there. And then that didn't work very well. And then, so in the end, I just went to London, and I had the means to do it. So I lived halfway to London, and my partner worked in London. So, and then, you know, of course, I found fellow gay people in London. There was none to be found in Farnham. So, and so in a way, it kind of, unfortunately, in a way, it separated me out of my cohort.
Yeah.
I was older, I was kind of foreign, I was this loudmouth homosexual, and yeah, and I could afford to go to London, I suppose. I didn't think of it then, but it must have, yeah. And so I just felt very different, and I found more, had more to do with the staff. The staff were younger and I was older. So one of the people who was starting her career in Farnham when I was starting mine was somebody called Anne Williams, who had been brought to teach us cultural studies. And our job as photography students in 1980 was to derail Anne's lectures wherever possible. So, so Anne would do all this theory lecture to us, and then we would try and derail it, and try to, because we realized that.
How much was theory part of your thinking about image making at the time?
Very little. It was a forced add-on. Yeah. Everybody hated it. Yeah. We were basically, it was an arty, crafty school. You made things. You made things and thought about them later.
Yeah.
Could we see some more of your slides, Sunil?
Oh yeah, I can keep going. So that was, I had a dark room in the beginning, so I was very lucky. I left college with a dark room. That was my best mate, Emily, from at the RCA. We were two queers in a small class of 6 or 7 people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's extraordinary. That doesn't happen anymore. The last time I went to the RCA a couple of years ago, there were 60 people in a year, not 6.
Yes. And when did you go to the RCA, Sunil? What year were you?
It was 81 and 83. And so 83, Photographers Gallery had this India show. It was part of the Festival of India. Oh, actually it says 82. I've got my years mixed up.
Yes.
So that was right in the middle of our RCA days. And so we went and we had our selfie taken with a Polaroid, as they did it in those days. And the gallery had set up this special corner where you could have your picture taken on a Polaroid as a memento. And then basically in London, I just sort of found like-minded people, and we had a lot of funded photography workshops. Camera work was one that I got close to in the East End. And in 86, there were these 2 shows that I was part of. One was Asian specific on the left, and one was lesbian and gay specific on the right. And again, there's some names you might recall. I mean, there's Arina Bhimji, for example, at the bottom. And so on.
Did you feel the RCA was sort of prepping you for a certain kind of photographic career, or was?
Yeah, it was. It was very much training ground for an elite. In fact, I remember on our first day, they gathered all the first years together across the disciplines because there weren't that many of us. It was possible to have us all in one room. And somebody made a speech about how we were the chosen ones. And we were following in the footsteps of David Hockney and Howard Hodgkin. And how could we let them down, kind of thing. And, you know, and then, you know, every now and then they'd bring you to the senior common room, which was full of their alumni's artworks, all of whom are very famous now. And so that's that was the attitude, you know, to basically to stepping stone to Cork Street galleries.
And so you obviously you took a different approach and
Yeah, I did.
rebelled against it.
I did. I made a fateful decision to not go do that and instead go across the river to the town hall and get involved with the GLC and cultural politics and the politics of inclusion, how art and culture is for everyone and all of that business. And then, you know, Black arts arrived. So by the mid 80s, so body politics was being discussed. This is another photographer's gallery exhibition. Yes. Where I got commissioned in '86 to do something. So I went back to India to make a proper series of pictures about Indian gay men that became exiles. But also in the mid 80s, this happened, the Black Arts movement. And so I became very much part of that, and I became Black politically, you know, so I'm really shocked about this BAME business today. There's no way I'm an ethnic minority, please. Can we not have BAME?
I'm really interested in that actually, Sunil, because I was listening to another talk you gave about this dislike of the BAME label, and it because of its, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's on the lack of cultural connection it has. It doesn't relate to anything. But could you explain a bit more about that? Because that term is used quite a lot still.
It is. It's spread everywhere, and it's become the kind of polite thing to say. And somehow I find it like it's gone back to 1970s. I think because ethnic minorities is a powerless, it's a kind of emasculated terminology. And so Black was a much more, it was a post-colonial moment. So in that sense, it was saying we're not a minority, you know, we're it was about Black power. It was a force to be reckoned with. And as a coalition of people, we found some kind of strength there. And then it kind of began to break up into African, Caribbean, and South Asian, as we'll see in a minute. So I'll just, if I can jump forward to Barry Lane. So I was involved with the GLC, which Margaret Thatcher closed as fast as she could. And then suddenly we were without a funding body. And so we trotted off to the Arts Council back across the river, who used to live in 105 Piccadilly in a very imposing building with chandeliers, I remember. And I met this guy, Barry Lane, who completely transformed my life, and I think the life of many other people. And we owe a lot to him. Barry Lane was a photography officer at the Arts Council, and he made it his business to almost single-handedly create a phenomena called independent photography in the UK, and funded publishing and practice, and allowed people like Martin Parr, people like Paul Graham to publish their early books. It was through funding from here. So it's to him we went for help when the financial rug was pulled under our feet with the demise of the GLC. And he said, look, I'd really like to help you, but you know, what is Black photography? We've never heard of it. No such thing, which was true. There had historically no such thing. And the Arts Council, being an institution, can't function without reports, you know, and like proof that something exists. So he commissioned this report. So that's what kicked it off. It's the thing on the left. And you see it's no longer called Black. It's called African, Caribbean, and South Asian, which I still prefer to the BAME. You know, I'd rather be Indian than be BAME. You know, come on, BAME doesn't mean anything. So I think this sets the tone for what we then became Autograph, which was a coalition of African, Caribbean, and South Asian. So these are the people who are. So actually, no, I jump back to the show. This is the exhibition at Brixton Art Gallery, 1986. 86 was obviously a big year. All of the community people were doing their thing. And so it was the first Black photo show that I can remember that had funding. I'm sure there were others, but had a certain level of funding. There were 10 people. We all made 10 pictures each. We got money for it, which we unheard of at the time.
Yeah.
And it was organized by Monica Baker on behalf of the GLC.
Mm.
And then having met each other, and we hadn't met each other before, we carried on meeting, and these informal meetings grew big and then shrank, over time.
Yeah.
So all kinds of Black Asian people would come and say, I want to be part of this. I have a camera, I take pictures, and then they would realize that, oh, it's not about commercial work and stuff, and they would leave.
Mm.
So which is why at the end, there was just that small group of people.
And could you just describe at that time as well what because the outputs were not just exhibitions, were they? There was a whole maybe you could describe the sort of program communities that existed around these exhibitions and other activities.
Yeah, so we had a very ambitious program.
Mm.
We had learned quite a lot from many of us had a background in the community darkroom gallery spaces like camera work and what's become photo fusion, and there were various other photo workshops. So we understood that we needed to have resources for we were a collective then. We wanted to be a collective of practitioners, and therefore we needed publishing. So we knew we wanted to have publishing because in the 80s we had no documentation. We had all these shows and no documentation. And we wanted to have an agency because that's how we understood photography made money, was to sell the actual pictures, but to an editorial market, to a reproduction world. So an agency, and then we wanted to have exhibitions. So that was the third thing. So that was going to be a big thing. And the first exhibition was again at camera work, back to camera work.
Yeah.
Portraits, because we thought it should be about us, who are we? This is the face of Black photography. And the fourth thing was education, because some of us, like me, had come out of formal education. And a lot of the people you see in this picture hadn't come out of that kind of formal art education. But in England, you'll notice there is a legacy of the 80s, is that a number of the practitioners whose names you bandied about a lot now were all coming out of art school then.
Yeah.
So they're coming with the education. I think the GLC liked that about that group of people because, the Isaac Julians and the Rina Bhimjis, because they'd come out of the Slade, they'd come out of St. Martin's, they spoke the art world lingo. They weren't just ghetto kids who didn't have the language. They knew who Foucault was, you know what I mean? Like they could talk back to you.
Yeah.
So that was quite key. And so there was, and then there were conferences. So part of Barry and the Arts Council was that he instituted photography national conferences, which we no longer have, sadly. So we had a few of those. I can show you a picture. We're on a train going to Newcastle here. Yeah. On the left is Deborah Willis, who was our great mate who we found in New York before anybody else. And there's Monica Baker, who organized that first show and then organized Autograph and all the rest of it. And there were the two queens of Black photography, one in New York and one in London.
Yeah.
And, we were unstoppable. I mean, who could say no to these two? Nobody. So that was scary. So, yeah.
And how much, actually, that's interesting. How international was the dialogue between, say, New York and London at that time?
Oh, it was essential because we realized that in the UK, we were tiny because we learned demographic politics at the GLC. So we're only 4% of the UK's population, which is why the minute you leave the big cities, it's a sea of white people, as Ingrid Pollard has talked about in her work, unlike America, for example. And so, but in terms of the globe and internationalism, suddenly we're in the majority. There's a hell of a lot more Asians and Africans around than it seems apparent. And which is why Trumpian politics are the way they are, because they're really scared they're going to be overtaken by a brown majority and so on. So yeah, so we thought it would strengthen us to have links abroad and in our own countries, and also especially in New York and in the US. The only thing in the US we found was there was nobody like us, because the US unfortunately suffers from a kind of apartheid. So Afro-Americans have their own gig, Latinos have their own thing. East Asians have their own thing. Autograph, I think, is a unique global organization where it's combined.
Yes, yeah.
We're presenting a united front.
Yeah.
And the others are all specialized. So that's a little unfortunate. Because when I went to New York and spoke somewhere, and Deborah would ask me to come and speak somewhere, and then I would stand up and say, well, as a Black British photographer, and everyone would look at me and laugh because they said, you're not Black. So that wasn't very helpful.
Yes, yes.
They still take it literally. They don't get the post-colonial thing.
Yeah.
So back then anyway, so.
Shall we show a few more images, Sunil?
Yeah, so we can carry on. So, so before we leave the 80s, there was Clause 28, so the work came in response to that and so on. And the end of the 1990 was a number of big shows. I got involved with curating.
Yeah.
Partly through that politics, going to people saying, why aren't there more shows, blah, blah, blah. So there was Economy of Science and the Photographers Gallery. AIDS had come along, big time in London and in the UK. Diana had made a difference in AIDS, and I was very fortunate. Part of my job was I was camera for hire in the 80s, and I managed to get a picture of her doing one of her famous handshakes with people who were HIV positive. This was in Earl's Court. And it led to an exhibition, Ecstatic Antibodies with Tessa Boffin, which arouses great interest even today, this particular project.
Yes. There's a lot of interest now on this period.
Yeah.
There's been a recent Channel 4, series about AIDS in the 80s, and
yeah.
I wonder what's your sort of feeling about this revisiting of that moment?
I think there's partly because my generation, I guess baby boomers, I'm in my late 60s, are all at the top of wherever they're running everything, and they have all the money. So I know people feel bitterly about them, us, I should say. And we're nostalgic. This was our youth. This is what we did. I feel very nostalgic about it. And I'm assuming other people who have more power than me are equally nostalgic. But then I've met young PhD students and postdocs who are very interested in this as well. For them, they want to know everything about it. I think it's how should I put it? I think the 80s for me was, in a nutshell, was an era of some kind of innocence.
Yes.
You believed things were getting better. You believed you were in a kind of company of like-minded people. I met Tessa because I used to go to meetings all the time. I went to a meeting about AIDS at the London Lesbian Gay Center and met this white woman called Tessa Boffin. And she and I said, we want to do an art show. And everybody laughed at us. But she and I went off, had a coffee and said, no, we'll do an art show. And we did. Yeah. And like that. But that only happens if you go out and meet like-minded people somewhere. But there was a kind of naivety about it. We weren't cynical. And plus the pressure and the urgency was so huge. The thing about AIDS was that it, a bit like COVID now, it was terrifying.
Yes.
Because it was a deadly disease. And so there was a sense of urgency. We need to do something, and we'd have to do it with each other. So the community was very important.
Yeah.
And there was a trust and everything. And I think we had a perfect enemy in the Tories, and especially in Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the perfect villain to have. Everybody loathed Margaret Thatcher. It doesn't matter about our differences, but Margaret Thatcher had to be disposed of somehow. United against that kind of Reagan-Thatcher politics. So
I'm being asked for more slides. Shall we?
Okay. So basically, after that, I left Autograph. Then I stopped working for them. Went off and taught briefly, and then got a curating grant from the Arts Council via the plan to start Innover. It was an Innover franchise, they called it. And I started this curating company in 1992, and it lasted till 2004. So that became my main day job, was to curate exhibitions in the art world. So I made this very curious leap from photography into the art world. Usually people there was this tension, as you might recall, Claire,
Yes.
between what's art and what's photography. And so I was, as you can imagine, a big full-time photography champion. I used to go and piss on the Tate. That was where all the art was. You know, they only bought work from artists. Bad photos by David Hockney, oh, we'll have them, thank you. Good photos by you, you can give them for free to the V&As. And that was how it was back in the bad old days. So I did my first art show cheekily based on photography.
Yes.
So there you go. That was Disrupted Borders. And then in between, I did projects where I could. So this project came up, Trophies of Empire. And I made a body of work called Trespass using computers and all that business. So yeah, so that's kind of how the 90s went by. This was a very successful project, actually. And it went to the Havana Biennial. And so I went. And so once again, then I met a whole lot of other people, you know, fellow artists of color, but from Latin America and Africa. So, you know, that's what was happening for me in the 90s. So the international was getting more and more important and actually meeting real people in that sense. Except in 95, I got diagnosed with HIV. So tragically, just when I was 40 something and being excessively full of myself, probably, and really sure of myself and very cocky and everything. And I got hit by HIV. So it was almost a disaster there. And I thought I was going to die actually for a day. Obviously I didn't. So anyway, so.
And did this was a point where would you say you really reconnected with your work, with back to sort of your own work, but also this idea of the self-portrait really became necessary in your work?
I think so. I made this body of work as a therapy. I was really not well for a while, for several months actually. It had a serious consequence. I had no money because I couldn't work. I was freelance. No work meant no income. Luckily I had a council flat, and my life shrank to the council flat. I had no money to do anything. And then Mark Seeley to the rescue, who had been running Autograph by then, came along and said, hey, what if I commission you to make something? And so he gave me some money, and I made From Here to Eternity about myself and the illness. And we have it up in the gallery now. We have actually the original prints from 99, in this case. And then I was kind of saved by an AHRC grant in 2000. For 3 years, I was employed. They could employ me at the university, and I could make a leisurely and have a monthly salary, something I'd never had. This very involved project called Homelands, looking at different places that were home to me. And I did a bit of the curating went on. This was the last show I did, was with Roshni Kempadu in 2004. It opened at the City Gallery in Leicester. And then I moved to India. So basically, by now, I think I turned 50. Black art seems to have had its day. I felt kind of slightly washed up, like I could see no purpose in London. Black arts had gone. The YBAs were on the upswing. There was Ineva, but it was like, it wasn't really really taking off in quite the way. And I was tired of making the same old arguments, going back to the beginning, and then accidentally ended up in India slightly. Well, in the sense that I've followed somebody. I move countries when I meet somebody, then I follow them to the other country. Not a good idea, because this time I was left high and dry. The minute I got there, the person said, oh dear, I've lost interest. Meanwhile, so then I'm standing there with my suitcase saying, what do I do now? But I'd had a big party in London saying, you're all racist. you're all so-and-so. I'm pissing off. You come by to you, or I'm going back to the motherland. And so then I had to make a go of it in India. So in Delhi, I find it's like year zero. You know, they have no photography at all. They don't show photography. They don't discuss photography. There's no magazine, nothing. So I got together with a couple of people and we started this publication. So there was some kind of discussion happening. I did a ton of research for one of the commercial galleries to do a contemporary show of Indian photography because nobody knew what there was. So here are all the Indian. Suddenly I said, look, there's over 50 of them all gathered here. There is such a thing. Then I came back to the Whitechapel and said, look, you can have an Indian show. I'm actually living there. What do you know?
Yeah.
And then I found all these young kids coming out of graduate school in Delhi who wanted to have a queer revolution. And they said, join us. And I said, but I'm older than your parents. And they said, doesn't matter, join us. So I joined them. There they are. And then, you know, we put on festivals and we did a photo festival because, you know, it's there was no Indian queer photography at all. So because there was no reason for it, nobody wanted it.
Yeah.
So we created a demand. I think this is where photo festivals are very useful, especially in regions that do not have photography support, you know, like in non-Western countries. So every year for a number of years, we had an annual photography cave festival and people submitted. And we've saved all of these. You know, I've got, not I, but our collective has now an archive of 600 queer Indian pictures. If anybody wants to have an Indian queer exhibition, it's all ready to go, you know, like that. So you create it, you know, it doesn't just happen. And then teaching. So that was my big thing. So I taught young kids. You know, I stopped them from throwing pencils at each other all day. Then we'd get the camera out. And UCA came and helped start an MA at the National Design School in India. I got involved with that, so I go and spend time there sometimes. So like that. So formal education is something I feel quite strongly about too. And then in India, then I just did some work, you know, started up some work and in the street, in the studio, like that. And then of course there was the Whitechapel show with Anthony, which was a massive undertaking. It took years for some reason. I thought it was never going to happen at some point. And Anthony, when he came to, this is Anthony Spiro, by the way, sorry. Who was working at the Whitechapel. He came to visit me in Delhi, and one night, everywhere we went, there was a bomb.
Yeah.
So it was really weird.
Yes, he talks about that still, Sunil.
And then this happened. So then I had to leave India. I did a show, and then the police came, and then I shut it down, and then that was that. And then
can you talk a bit about the new Pre-Raphaelites work and where that came from?
Yeah, it came from this. It came from this moment that I was sensing with my group in India, the young kids, that they were fed up of the old ways and the old moralities and the old hypocrisies, and there was an impatience to be allowed to express their emotions. And India, having, I think, missed the lesbian and gay liberation moment, was having a big queer moment suddenly in the 2000s. It went straight to queer. And so I was in London and I wandered by chance into the Tate one day, the old Tate, and into a bunch of Pre-Raphaelite paintings and looked at them more closely than I had before. And I thought, wow, they really reminds me, there's an emotional feeling that reminds me of what's happening in Delhi. So I went back to Delhi and recreated them, some of them, in a studio situation.
And these are the ones that featured, were they, in the exhibition?
These ones no, that was Sun City, the one that got closed?
Yes.
No, that was Sun City. No, these didn't get closed.
Okay.
That was Sun City, that's this one.
Yes.
That kind of led to my departure. But by then, luckily, and then I was single all those years. My romantic life was also running alongside. And then I met somebody and I promptly dragged him off to Toronto with the help of the Art Gallery of Ontario and Stephen Bulger, who was the gallerist who helped us and organized it for us. And we got married in Toronto City Hall. That allowed us to then emigrate back to London. And so now we are back here. But things have changed in India. That's my Indian gallery on the right. They produced a monograph and they were happy to call it queer, you know, that was in Delhi. Like, can you imagine 20 years before, nobody would mention the word gay, and suddenly it's there. And so me and the husband did a book. We got a book commission about India, went back there. That became an art show in Houston, and then went to the Kochi Biennial in India. That's us talking there. And then, of course, there was Christopher's, the books came out recently, the archive. So now there's work coming out of the archive. That's why I'm sitting here last few years, getting the archive sorted out.
Yes, we didn't get much time to talk about your relationship to the archive and the catalogue that goes alongside the exhibition at the Photographers Gallery is really an archival.
Yeah,
focus.
that's here. Yeah, I'll just quickly show it. So I'll stop sharing this. So this is Hale's Gallery in New York. So they're showing Christopher Street, the archival pictures, but modern silver prints of them looking. And so I'm very fortunate that having turned my back on the commercial art world, they're still willing to deal with me now. And now is when I really need them. And because I don't have any pension or anything, and my parents predicted correctly, I've arrived at 65 without a penny. So I need something to sell now. Yeah.
But it's amazing. I mean, Sunil, it is amazing how resonant these images are now, and how much publicity. I mean, how you've had, you know,
they really took off these pictures.
Yeah, really incredible response from people.
Yeah,
and that you know, how does that? Did you expect that, or was it something that just, I don't know?
Not really. No, because you know, I'd never really printed many of them. I didn't have the money then, and I'd only printed a few. I'd never seen them until recently, you know, enlarged in any way. So only when we scanned here and looked at them on a screen, and we thought, oh, there actually many of them are sharp. I didn't even think they would be, because they were analog days. I only had one crack at it, and then I just put them on my website. And the first person to seriously take notice was Gregory Barker, you know, of Stanley Barker, the book publishers. And Gregory got in touch and said, look, I want to do a book of these. And I said, wow, that's amazing. What do you think? I said, yeah, let's do the book. And I sent him everything, and he organized everything. And I met him at the printers, and it did incredibly well. I was really surprised. It kind of did itself. I don't know. I didn't really think about it too much. And the next thing I knew, it was at Paris Photo, and it had been shortlisted and everything. And yeah, and it's sold out. I was quite amazed. I had no more copies left, except the gallery had some because they'd bought some very early. The bookshop was telling me.
Yes.
But so it was quite amazing, and so they were very happy. And so we did another one. But yeah, I had no idea it would take off like this. It even led to another job. I got a job last year. This time I just come back from recreating Christopher Street for Helmut Lang's clothes, fashion thing. So that was quite extraordinary. Yeah, it sort of went on and on.
It's been a busy year, despite the weirdness of the last 11 months. It's actually been a busy time for you.
Yeah. So I might stop sharing, and I'm just going to show everybody the book.
I'm aware of the time, actually. It's 5:02. So
so this is the book. Can I just do a plug?
Yes,
I promised Mark Seeley I would.
Go on.
Yeah, it's an autograph book edited by Mark Seeley, and it's a scrapbook of everything that we've talked about. Okay, I've done that.
No, that's good. That's good. You're right. You're right. So Michael and Joe, I wonder, do you want to open up for?
Yes, thank you so much, Claire and Sunil, for that. I also grew up in the 80s, and your view of the 80s was rather different to my middle-class upbringing on the suburbs of London, I have to say. And we've got some questions that have come through. So in fact, what I will do is just sort of relay those to you, Sunil. And we've got one asking whether you would describe yourself in the 80s through your photography as documenting, or were you campaigning through your publication of your photographs?
Well, originally I thought I wanted to be campaigning social documentarist. I really emerged from college thinking I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Eugene Smith, let's say, someone like that.
Mm.
And then when I went to see the picture editors, they said, that's not possible because it's no longer the 50s and television does all that. And so there was no work in that area as such. So commercially, it wasn't going anywhere. And then critically speaking, it had been, documentary was much criticized in college and by my peers. And we became anxious about consent and control and power. And magazines like 10/8 were discussing this and who's taking the picture, who's in the picture, who's it for. And I was experiencing this by working for the Times Group. I used to work for the Times, the Daily Times and the Times Literary Supplement and all. And that you take a picture of something and it's completely editorialized. So I had the real life experience of what happens. You have no say in anything. And then I began to appreciate, well, really, the entire group, when they had the strike, you know, I stepped away because it was, Murdoch had the final say and his minions underneath him. You couldn't do anything on your own, absolutely not. So yeah, it became, I had to find another way. So this independent photography that came up, the funded kind of type arts council kind, where you make pictures that you like and put them up in camera work for a while. And then after that, they live under your bed, basically, for the rest of the time. That's what it was.
So we've got a couple of questions that are not on dissimilar themes. So I'll take the one from Stuart that's just come up on my screen. How do you feel about the 1980s movement, such as Four Corners, the Camera Works Collective, and how they changed photography? And just as a supplementary along a similar theme, it seems that that early mid-1980s period was a very important one for photography that I think we're only starting to understand at the moment through some publications that have come out recently and work in the Camera Works archive. So how, perhaps you can talk to that a little bit about those movements in the early 80s.
Yeah, no, I think they were very important, and they created a cohort of people beyond college, outside in the real world in a way which I'm not sure how easy that is today, even though we have the internet. But by simply going out and about and to various meetings, I met people through the Wandsworth Photo Co-op, people like Chris Boot, who went on to run Magnum and now runs Aperture, you know, so, and people like Gina Glover, who now runs Photofusion, and camera work itself, multifaceted, had magazine, had resources, understood. There were different kind of rainbow coalitions in there. The women were doing their thing. It was soon after Hackney Flushes and all. And Joe Spence was around. And so you had to be aware of feminist movement. You had to be around of the race issue, you know, so the Black people were saying, you know, we need to be recognized too, and all the rest of it. So I think there was this understanding that photography was the ideal medium for us, actually, I think. Actually, video and photography together, the kind of representational mediums, were the most directly conveying our situation as an urban class that was looking for a means of expression. And I think having these spaces and these possibilities of making new work, there was just enough stimulation to keep people like me going, people like Rosie Martin going, I don't know, people like Eve Lomax, who wrote for Camera Work, the magazine, and then you would meet them. And I remember going to all kinds of interesting lectures and things as well. So you had the academic side continuing beyond college in a way, because you could go, I remember going to the ICA and hearing Judith Williamson give a talk about Joe Spence, with Joe Spence present, you know. And I remember raising my hand and saying, why is Judith doing all the talking when Joe is sitting over there? But anyway, that was always my issue about the theory people, but they were always there. But I mean, I was being cocky, but you know what I mean? Like you could you were at least aware of who they were. You know how to find them. I would go to seminars by the people running Screen. You remember Screen? And there were people like Mandy Merck, who can talk 90 to the dozen in theory language, and you have to struggle to follow her, and Laura Mulvey. And you just sort of, there was a theory and practice going hand in hand, and people lived in squats. People weren't worried about making it like large sums of money and stuff like that. You just got by how you could, and it was possible to kind of get by. You know, we were lucky in that period. You know, there was still the NHS, there was still squats, there was still council house. I feel really, I don't know how young graduates today emerge into a London where there's it's very expensive. There's no funded spaces, or I don't see any immediate ones. Like, I can't imagine what it's like, and how do they meet, and how do they create new cohorts of their own peers?
Yeah, it's a different world, isn't it? So we've got a question here that, just to bring you back to your own practice and your own work. It seems, so the question is really around that 1995 and your diagnosis with HIV. It seems that after that period, your work became much more introspective. Would that be a fair comment about your work at that point? And do you think it has evolved since then?
I think I overcame my body shyness, having exposed my naked body to the world, and realized that a picture of it is just an object to be worked on, and it's not literally me. And so I think I became braver about wanting to explore what being gay and Indian meant. I think earlier I was trying to, but I was both feeling a bit shy about it, and also no gay Indians either in India or in London wanted to be in the picture. So it was like a non-starter. And it was just like a huge struggle, and nobody seemed interested in them either. You know, like the curators weren't exactly excited about it. So it was a combination of that, you know, and yes, I was reacting very much to the social events around me. So they became a kind of trigger to the subject matter. So, so like the whole pretended families thing was a response to Clause 28, but also a response to the photographic problem of making pictures of demonstrations as a left-leaning person. You know, what does that mean? So often photographs of demonstrations are from the outside and are taken from the vantage point of the police. How do you take them from the inside and yet get a feeling of the, you know, like, so those were the thorny issues that you struggled with.
So I'm going to take two final questions because we're slightly up against the clock. So first of them, just to bring you back to the Christopher Street series, and a question around, have you been contacted by people in that series since publication?
Okay, the Christopher Street series, well, I think another reason, which maybe I haven't emphasized so far, is that I didn't mention it at the very beginning, that the 80s in London was very anti-gay. I can't tell you how anti-gay homophobia was allowed to exist. People would tell you to your face, you know, people in college would tell me, people on the streets would tell you, the police were busy arresting people. Then we had AIDS. It was, you know, it was not a great time. So that's also why I think the pictures, you know, there wasn't much gay stuff allowed. You know, it was part of the general homophobia of the time. And suddenly, I think it's been reconsidered. And so in answer to the question about the consequences of suddenly publishing them, yes, I've heard from at least one or two of the people in the pictures who've written to me saying, actually, I'm still alive, because one of the assumptions people have is that everybody in my pictures is dead from AIDS, because it's just before AIDS arrived, right, in that population. And could he have a print? So I sent him one. That was quite sweet. Another more complicated one was one of my, when I was an undergraduate and 20 years old, and I was doing gay liberation through Gay McGill in Montreal, one of the lecturers who was part of our group wrote to me, seeing the book, saying, one of the people in the, actually he didn't see the one in the book, he saw the one that the Guardian published of the book, one of the pictures from Christopher Street. And he said the guy in that picture was somebody he used to date for 10 years. And he wondered if I'd actually met him, but actually I had just taken a picture. So,
Okay, and then just finally, so it's really about what you're doing now. So you're obviously teaching at Farnham, I believe.
Yeah.
And so we've two sort of related questions again about how do you approach that teaching of modern day students? And secondly, someone's asking whether you've recently completed a PhD and wondered what the title might be.
Oh, let's do the easy one first. Yes, I did a PhD at Westminster recently, and it's called Queer Migrations. It's about how I recently came to understand my migration journey, not as a departure. I'd often thought about it leaving the big motherland, the big timeless India behind, going to a much smaller place in a sense, of to Canada, with a shorter history and fewer people, so to speak. And now I've come to understand my journey more as an arrival rather than a departure, that if I was very lucky, in fact, to have arrived in Montreal in 1969, straight after Stonewall, where my gay self could really flourish. If I stayed in Delhi, I would be probably married with children and dating some ever younger men on the side and feeling increasingly depressed about it and practically suicidal. So I think Canada saved me in a way and gave me a gay alternative, which wasn't possible where I lived at the time, and for which I'm very grateful. But of course, because I did a PhD, I had to get it completely involved with queer theory, which also didn't exist back in my day. So that was all news to me. So the great thing about doing PhDs in retrospect, because mine was a retrospective one, you write about what you've done for the last 10 years, was you theorize them from the vantage point of today. So I had a hell of a lot of reading to do because I hadn't bothered to read all this stuff. I knew there was something called queer theory, but I'd never really sat down and tried to figure it out. And lo and behold, I discovered, yes, it does exist. It actually originates at Yale. I actually went to Yale to give a talk, and I met the people in the department. It came out of gender studies and feminism and all at Yale. And it really means some very specific things. And so my library is much more up to date. I know how to find an article when I want one, and I know how to use JSTOR. And so when I teach, so come then on to the teaching, when I teach students, I've become a kind of theory person. I could tell them that it's important to know what's been written about their subject and how to find it. And also that I'm actually aware of the critical theories of today. I mean, of the 2000, of the teens. So, I mean, I used to be very lazy. So I go to photography class and say, oh yeah, there was this person called Roland Barthes, and there was this woman called Susan Sontag, and that was kind of the end of it. Maybe you'd mentioned Foucault, but now we're like beyond all that, aren't we? So then I think getting the PhD made me feel much more able to teach young kids today. Otherwise, I'd have felt like some old crock. But I enjoy teaching. You know, I teach with Anna and Karen and, you know, Anna Fox and all. And we're all old hags from Farnham anyway. So, and so it's very good. You know, she's the good cop. Everyone adores. I'm the bad cop. I kind of say weird, terrible things to them. I think because I'm part-time and they can't fire me. But and also because, you know, when I studied with Lisette Model, she was a darling, this is shit, go try again. And you can't say that now. You have to say, you know, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about going to the Tate and having a look at? No, they haven't thought about that yet. So but no, I do enjoy, I love being with young kids actually. So they give you a lot because they're full of ideas and interests.
I think that's probably a perfect note to end on. And I think there's probably a PhD in the influence of Farnham over British photography for the last 30 odd years as well, because there's been so many important figures that have come out of that university that it needs putting together. But I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the Royal Photographic Society, Sunil, for sharing your life story in many ways with us and for sharing some of your images. And I know people want to see a lot more of your images. So do, if the opportunity arises for just a few days, you may be able to catch Sunil's show at the Photographers Gallery. Claire's nodding. Thank you, Claire.
Okay.
And also Sunil's publications. Yeah, again, I think I'll be going out to get the book you showed with the scrapbook with Mark, which Mark has done, because that's going to, I think, tell me a lot, and I look forward to seeing that myself. So thank you for sharing your story. Claire, thank you so much for leading the conversation with Sunil. Again, it works really well where there are two people that know each other and can bounce off each other, and that worked really well.
Thank you.
So thank you to the Photographers Gallery for allowing you to do it for us. And Joe McDonald, thank you, our awards manager, for arranging this evening. It's been a very special evening and we appreciate it. And for those of you that registered, thank you for joining us this evening and staying with us. We will share a link to the recording tomorrow or Thursday, so do take the opportunity to see that. And thank you both very much indeed. Thank you, Joe, and thank you to our audience again. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Sunil.